Hi, I'm Ben, welcome back to my channel. A few months ago, I set myself the challenge to read the entire Booker longlist, and I wanted to do that before the shortlist was announced. I've never read the entire long list of any prize before in any year, and so I was really excited to do it, and when I decided that I wanted to pursue this goal, I had expected that when the long list came out, I would have already read maybe 3-4 books that made the cut. In the end, there was just one title that I'd already read, so that meant reading 12 books in 7 weeks. Much faster than my usual reading pace. If you've seen my ranking of the entire long list, you'll know that I managed it, which I was really pleased with. But that was a pretty quick and breezy run through each book. And I've been using these dedicated review videos to give you a little bit more detail on what I thought of the books and why. This is the fourth and final of that series of videos, although as a reminder, you don't need to watch them in any particular order. I'm just covering them largely in the order that I read them. I'm going to jump right into it, and I've got 3 books to talk to you about today. And we're going to start with How to Build a Boat by Elaine Feeney. There was quite a lot of Irish domination on the list this year. There were 4 Irish books, and this was the last one of those that I read. I think this is Feeney's second novel, although at the time, for some reason, I had the idea in my head that it was a debut. Anyway, the focal point of this novel is a character named Jamie. He's a neurodivergent teenager whose mother sadly died in childbirth. He's just about to start college, and I mean that in the high school sense rather than in the more American university sense. But while he loves science and maths, he finds it all a bit pedestrian in the way that it's taught, and he doesn't get on particularly well with more discursive subjects like history and English, and he doesn't get on very well with his peers at school either, who treat him like a bit of a weirdo. His grand ambition doesn't have much to do with school though. He wants to build a perpetual motion machine, which is actually impossible according to the laws of physics, but he thinks if he can do that, then he can somehow reconnect with his mother, who he only experiences through an old film of her swimming, her red swimming hat bobbing in the water. We also get the perspectives of a few other characters too. There's Tess, who is a teacher at his school, wrestling with an unfulfilling marriage and some difficult decisions about whether to embark on motherhood. And there's Tig, who's a new woodwork teacher at the school. He seems like a bit of a nomad, a bit of a hippie. He's a bit of an outsider and an anarchist. Over the course of the book, we flip between these characters' perspectives, and they come together to build the titular boat. I think the premise here is fine. It's maybe a little more saccharine than I usually turn to, but it's a tale of misfits and found family, of people coming together around a cause bigger than themselves. It's a well-trodden type of story, and there's definitely an audience for that. Unfortunately though, for me, I just didn't think the execution was particularly good. This book for me just felt a little bit all over the place, and I don't need to find characters particularly likeable, but I just didn't massively enjoy my time with them in this book. I did sympathise with Jamie, but I feel like we were supposed to really connect with Tig and him be like our eyes into this situation. But to me, he just came across as a bit of a dickhead. I didn't really like the way he spoke to or treated some of the other characters in the book. But yeah, I mean, likability isn't a deal breaker for me, but I do need characters to be believable. Sadly, I just felt that they were making really crappy, annoying decisions the entire way through the book in a really unconvincing way. This believability problem permeates the plot as well. Really early in the book, there's an interaction Tess has with Alexa, and it just didn't make any sense to me. Like, I don't know why we were listening in on it, and it didn't reflect the reality of talking to one of these home automation assistants. It's a small thing, but it set the tone for me in how believable and well researched this book was. Dropped plot lines are in abundance. Jamie's dad is really central at the start of the book and then just goes missing for large portions of it. One example that didn't sit right with me was this really dark interaction about possible child abuse that was mentioned once and then never picked up again. The form is kind of weird. Most of the book is told in the third person, but then there are these 3 random chapters in the first person from Jamie's perspective. Why? I have no idea. Had these been regular interludes at moments of high stress or high tension for Jamie, used to explain like his internal rationale for actions we as readers might not otherwise have understood, it could have been really effective. But it's just 3 chapters, one after the other, at a random place. And then we don't hear Jamie's voice again outside of dialogue for the rest of the book. It made it feel a little bit like this book had been sent off to print midway through an edit. I listened to this on audio, and I do understand that the print book plays a little bit more with poetic form. This didn't come through in the audio, so I can't say if it added anything or not, but it was really well narrated by Kieran O'Brien. I enjoyed that aspect of it. and O'Brien is also the narrator of the bee sting and he does Dickie's part, so that was really nice. One other positive that I should highlight is that the epilogue is really nice, really effective, and it showcases Feeney's background as a poet in a way that the rest of the book just didn't. There is a good story in here, the premise is touching, and I wish Feeney had been a little bit more poetic. The image of the mother swimming, the magic of the perpetual motion machine and how these things come together could have been made much more of, and I think it would have been like a really magical, interesting experience. This is entirely my opinion, of course, and there are definitely readers who will love this book. As I was reading it, I wondered if it might be for fans of books like Libby Page's The Lido, so if you enjoyed that, I think you might get a lot out of this one. And clearly the Booker judges liked it. Sadly, it just wasn't for me. Next, I read A Spell of Good Things by Ayòbámi Adébáyò. This is Adébáyò's second novel following her Women's Prize nominated debut, Stay With Me, which I haven't read yet, but I've heard really good things about, and after reading this, it's definitely on my radar. This book is set in Nigeria, and we have two main protagonists and points of view that we move between, representing two very different families. The first is Eniola, a teenager from a poor family that's struggling to get by since his father lost his job. The family have had to make hard choices about earning an income, resorting to selling possessions and begging, and tough decisions about how they prioritise spending. They struggle to put food on the table, but Eniola's and his sister's school fees are also overdue, and they're being ridiculed and punished on a daily basis as a result. The family want to keep the kids in private school because even though it's the cheapest and worst one, it gives them a fighting chance at success. The other protagonist is Wuraola, a young doctor in her first year of medical practice, who's from a very wealthy family. She's dealing with the fact that she's overworked and her hospital doesn't have sufficient resources to really give patients the right level of care. And she's also navigating a relationship that's progressing somewhat out of her control, which is also becoming increasingly unsettling. Wuraola's family are very well-to-do. They wield political influence and they give her the finer things in life, but they also have lots of expectations of her. These come not just from her mother and her father, but her many other relatives, and particularly her aunts. They have expectations about how she should dress and how she should act, when she should get married and have children, and lots more things like that. These characters do play an important role in each other's stories, but there is very little direct overlap. There is, however, a nice juxtaposition between what's going on in one storyline and what's going on in another. Eniola's family live in a house that the landlord hasn't even bothered to paint, while Wuraola's family lives on a street named after her parents. At one point, Eniola is being lashed at school for his school fees not being paid, and another girl in the same position holds out her left hand for that to be lashed. Meanwhile, Wuraola holds out her left hand when she's ambushed with a marriage proposal she's not expecting. In another moment, Eniola's family is deciding whether to starve or pay rent, while Wuraola's family is counting the hundreds of pieces of meat brought for a 50th birthday party and complaining about it. These are examples of something that I think the book does really well more generally, and that's to paint a good picture and bring to life Nigerian society. The difference in experience between the rich and the poor, the complex relationships and tensions between the Igbo and Yoruba people, the political corruption, the enterprise and ambition of the people and the way that they navigate social norms and political structures. It paints a really good picture of how women navigate Nigerian society, often at an economic disadvantage even when they're wealthy. And it's all done in this way that shows you rather than tells you. I didn't find it particularly didactic at all. At a line level, the writing is really nice. I particularly liked the dialogue. There were so many fun little turns of phrase. I think there's one where someone's asking for a cold beer and they say they want one that's done serious jail time in the fridge. The characters are all really well developed, and I particularly enjoyed the younger sisters of both protagonists. We do get chapters here and there from other characters' perspectives, like Wuraola's mother, which I thought was really effective in rounding out the context and the lives of these people. The drawback for me was that this book was really slow to get going. Part of that is just because of the way Adébáyò builds up these dual worlds that the characters live in, and that makes sense. But at times I was really willing the book to just move a bit faster and get on with it. That's a shame, because I think a lot of readers might be weary by the time things ramp up. The climax of this book is really good. The last 100 pages are super tense, super gripping. I wondered if the structure of the book might have been a bit better had we got glimpses of the climax throughout the book to keep the tension and propel us through the story. A bit like what Maggie O'Farrell does with The Marriage Portrait, or what Anthony Durr does in All the Light We Cannot See. Overall, I enjoyed this one. I think I was a little bit Booker fatigued, but I would definitely read more of Adébáyò's work. I think she is a wonderful author. The final book that I'm going to review is actually the one I read first. So all the books I've reviewed so far, I've talked about in the order that I read them, but this one I read before the long list was announced, and that is This Other Eden by Paul Harding. I have read and reviewed it earlier in the year, and I will link to that video in the description, but I'm including it just for completeness, and this is more of a recap review where I'm going to reflect on how I feel about the book with a bit more distance from the reading experience. As a reminder, this book is loosely based on the real life events that happened on Malaga Island just off the coast of Maine, where a multiracial and mixed race community was forcibly evicted and their homes razed on the island in the name of public health. The island in this story, though, is called Apple Island, hence the enormous apple on the front cover, and it's a community founded by Benjamin Honey in the 19th century. The book starts off with a history of the island, so the first 30 or 40 pages is this quite accelerated history of Benjamin Honey's founding and then his descendants, and then we focus in on two main characters. Esther Honey, who I think is like a great-great-great-granddaughter of Benjamin Honey, but she's like an older lady, a grandmother at the time we meet her, and she's somewhat of a matriarch on the island. And we also focus on her grandson, Ethan Honey, who is very fair-skinned and could almost pass for white, and has a gift for drawing. I remember really struggling to get into this one, and that hasn't really changed in my memory. The writing keeps you at a bit of an arm's length, and there are a lot of long, poetic sentences filled to the brim with this florid, descriptive prose. I don't think that's quite the style I enjoy or vibe with, and there's something about this book that is both clinical and poetic at the same time, which I'm not sure makes sense now that I'm saying it out loud, but it is how I feel, so there. I did enjoy the characters, and I think there are images that have really stayed with me. So there's like the use of photographs that are taken, which are turned into curiosities and postcards on the mainland. There's Ethan's experience of leaving the island, which has really stuck with me. There's a bunch of medical professionals shuffling ashore to measure the faces and bodies of the island inhabitants. And then the climax of the book is the forcible eviction, which takes a bit of a tragic turn. I look back on the book as one that's quite sensitive but not sentimental, and I think it treats what is a very complex situation with a lot of care. Since its Booker nomination, this has been read by a lot more readers and also been subject to a bit more critique and criticism. Paul Harding is white, and I think it is a really thorny thing for a white person to write about a historical event that happened mainly to non-white people, and also for a white reviewer like me to assess it. But for what it is worth, I do think this is done really well. The book feels well researched, and Harding seems to be very careful with his prose. If anything, perhaps a little bit too careful. I don't see this particularly as a white saviour story or really told from a white perspective. In my reading of the book, it definitely felt like it centred Esther Honey in particular. But I do understand the criticism that there are a lot of characters who aren't particularly vocal in this book. A number of inhabitants of the island don't have much of a voice, but I want to give Harding the benefit of the doubt that I think that this is a device that he is using to show how these characters are disenfranchised. They're excluded from society and often undereducated. And because of this, they suffer because they can't articulate what they think and feel. I mean, I don't actually think that's a particularly subtle strand of the book. It is basically explicitly described as the experience of Esther's son and Ethan's father. Overall, I didn't love this book, but I did respect it. While the prose was a little bit over the top for me, a little bit too much, many other people have described how beautiful they found it. It's now on the Booker shortlist, but it's also on the shortlist for the National Book Award, and I think it's definitely got to be a contender for the Pulitzer Prize next year. Definitely an interesting book, and one that I think could provoke a lot of discussion. And not only because he's one of 3 Pauls on the Booker shortlist. So that's a wrap on this video and on all of my Booker reviews for 2023. Not really sure what to do with myself now. We've got quite a long wait until the winners ceremony, and while I don't have any Booker content planned, If you've got any ideas, do let me know in the comments. Also, let me know if you've read any of the books I talked about in this video. I'd love to hear what you thought about them. Any that you haven't read and you're really intrigued by, or any that you have read and have thoughts on. If you enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. And as ever, if you want to see more from me, hit subscribe and you'll see a new video once a week from me in your subscription feed. But until next time, toodles.